So, hello.
Hi.
Great pleasure to meet
Nice to meet you.
Okay.
When I was young, there was virtually no heroic fantasy as such. There were sort of large fantasies like The Worm Ouroboros by Edison and sort of very strange books that had no particular place, a real place. But there was very, very little until the mid-1950s, really. I was 15 then, and I'd been reading Dunsany and a few other writers of the day. But the first book, I think it was 1956 it came out, was that I read, that I suppose I recognized as heroic fantasy, was Poul Anderson's The Broken Sword, which was a Scandinavian fantasy, using Scandinavian types, and it was actually set in England, but shortly after the Norse conquest of England. So, and I really loved it. I mean, I just thought it was superb. I also started to read Conan. You couldn't find Conan very much, except in very small editions by a private press. And they were in America, and I didn't have very much money, so it would take me a long time to get enough money together to buy one of the Conan books. There was one paperback, and that was it. So that was really how I started to read it. I then came to Tolkien, who I'd heard about, and in fact had interviewed without having read his books when I was young. He was very, very nice. And C.S. Lewis was a fairly frequent attendant at a pub in London where science fiction fans used to go. So Lewis had helped me get the interview with Tolkien. And he didn't give me that much time, but he gave me, he was very, very pleasant and nice. And he didn't seem to mind when I admitted that I hadn't actually read his books. But I was doing an Edgar Rice Burroughs fanzine by that time, and that was what I was interviewing him for, because he was, again, one of the very few people who were writing that kind of fantasy. That was the state. I then actually tried to read the Tolkien books and found that I really didn't like them at all. But that was just me. I mean, it was. There's a certain quality in English prose which has the smell of the nursery about it, the smell of the BBC Children's Hour, trying to keep the children all nice little middle class children, and that's, for me, that's the tone of Tolkien, and I never was a nice little middle class child. So, but then I was a professional writer from the age of 16, and I wrote pretty much everything that there was to write. Features, interviews, comics, pretty much anything that I could make money doing. And one day, Harry Harrison, science fiction writer whom I knew, who was also writing comics for the same company that I worked for, he said, well, I'm seeing Ted Carnell, who was the editor of some English science fiction and fantasy magazines. I'm seeing him in the pub across the street. Why don't you come across and have a drink? I knew Ted, so I said, yeah, fine. So we all went over together, and we were just chatting in the pub about nothing in particular. until eventually Ted said he started to express an enthusiasm for sword and sorcery fiction of the kind that Howard wrote. And we sort of talked about that, and we wondered if there was still an audience for that day, for the early 19. It was 1960. If there was an audience in 1960 for that kind of fiction, and I said, Ted said, "Why don't you write one and we'll find out?" And I said, "Okay, I'll write you one." And the short version of this long story is that I wrote the first Elric. I decided not to. I didn't want anything. I wanted it to be as far away from any other sword and sorcery, heroic fantasy story there was, just to be as different as possible. So that's how I came to write Elric. And I thought it was going to be one story, and then I thought it was going to be two stories, and then three, and eventually, the reader response was tremendous. I just hit the right moment for the revival of sword and sorcery fiction. I was arguing with the English imperialists, the left-wing imperialists from 1900, say, onwards, and people like H.G. Wells, who still thought that the empire was a good thing. And so although they were left-wing and they had many good liberal ideas, they were not particularly anti-imperialist. And the Fabians, I don't know if you know about the Fabians, but the Fabian Society was the sort of intellectual driving force for the Labour Party, for the Socialist Party. So they were all Fabians, and many of those Fabians were convinced imperialists, as was Rudyard Kipling, who was not left-wing. Excuse me. So what I did was what's I think called an intervention in modern literary parlance, and I tried to imagine the kind of future that they were imagining, the imperial future, where there was a Pax Britannica or a Pax Europa or whatever it was, Pax Americana. I mean, they all had these various ideas, and see what the reality of that would be like. And so I just imagined writing a science fiction story from the point of view of around 1900, setting it in I think it was 1971, whenever the first one was set, and examine the realities of imperialism, because I was not arguing so much with the dead Fabians as with the live Fabians who still had nostalgia for that particular period, and it was only nostalgia. I'm not saying they wanted to bring back the empire. I mean, they weren't that kind of nut, but they did. They still felt that it would have been a good thing if we'd kept India, and so that's what I was. That's what I wanted it for. So I sort of created the technique, as it were, to have that argument. And then almost immediately, well, not almost immediately, but a few years passed, and suddenly there's this strange subgenre which is called steampunk, which absolutely reeks of nostalgia. It's it's all nostalgia, whereas I was actually arguing against nostalgia. So as far as what I was doing is concerned, it was completely at odds with what steampunk largely is. I mean, that's not true of all steampunk by a long shot. Now, I actually like it. I mean, I find it very attractive because it's very nostalgic, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think it's a particularly interesting form for confronting the issues of the day. And unfortunately, I mean, I was just talking to a guy downstairs who I've known for years, who is a keen Golden Age science fiction fan. I mean, and in a way, I would find more in common with him than I would with some younger contemporary, because essentially I find science fiction was the science fiction of Galaxy magazine, of Philip K. Dick, Alfred Bester, Robert Sheckley, all writers who confronted issues, whose whole interest in writing science fiction was in looking at their society. Fred Pohl, Pohl and Kornbluth, I mean, the list's pretty good. I was never at odds with those people. I mean, all I was trying to do was develop, out of what they were doing, develop something else, but not reject it, because that's the kind of science fiction that I liked and read. It's the kind of science fiction that Simone de Beauvoir read. I mean, it's not you know, it was a pretty good kind of science fiction, and very interesting from what it was trying to do. The reason that people like myself and Ballard and Aldous and various other people were attracted to science fiction was precisely because the English social novel had become completely mired in nostalgia and sentiment, and I mean, you could just smell it. The American novel was pretty much the same at that time, and what it took to revive, I think, those novels were exactly what we were trying to do with New Worlds, which was to marry the two, to take the best of both and make them into something substantial and useful.
Too low.
Make it 20.
All right, I'll set it somewhere between 10 and...
20. Piece of cotton, sir.
Well, I'm a scientist. I can't go guessing, messing around.
Don't argue, Powis.
I hope to God you haven't underestimated him.
As far as Jerry Cornelius is concerned, that was the film, the final program, and I was horrified by what the director did, and was almost immediately at odds with the director, not with the producers. Unfortunately, the producers didn't like what the director was doing either. What had happened was that EMI, who were then one of the major funders of English cinema, had seen that Robert Fust had done two very successful Grand Guignol movies, Dr. Vibes and The Amazing Dr. Vibes, or whatever they were, which really had a lot of old English character actors who were very good at melodrama, being killed, periodically. He'd been in the Avengers. He'd directed the Avengers, and it was pretty much exactly Avengers come onto the screen. So he had some clout with the AMI, who had produced those two pictures, and so they had this script which had been made insane by a speed freak friend of mine who'd insisted on writing the first draft, and then hid up in the Savoy Hotel, babbling about J. Edgar Hoover and fixing meth, and just wrote a script about this thick, which was entirely about J. Edgar Hoover and nothing about Jerry Cornelius. But eventually, because eventually the script emerged. This guy, Fust said he would do a script. So Fust did a script, and it was crap. It was total crap. It was sexist. It was all the things that Cornelius had been against. He somehow reversed and turned into the thing, you know, made them what I hated most. So it was taking something that was pretty important to me in terms of how I thought. It wasn't a great book, but how I thought, and taking that thought and just really messing with it. The irony now is that however long has passed, 40 years, about 40 years has passed since the film was made, and now it has a huge audience of people who go to see it precisely because it's 1960s nostalgia, and so there's, I mean, you can't win. But I didn't like the movie myself. The guy tried to get Billie Holiday in on the soundtrack, which is pretty much says it all. I've nothing against Billie Holiday, but that's the kind of thing that he was trying to do with it. I had the book was people essentially male and female sexuality had sort of blended. There was no one thing or the other. I'd done a lot of stuff like that. And he just pushed it all back into bad lesbian jokes and stuff like that. I mean, it was pretty awful. And I didn't write for a year after he'd done that. And the producer at the last minute was also trying to save it from what the guy was doing to it, because the producer had bought it. It was pretty awful. But it's now a sort of underground cult success.
I have to confess that I haven't read your books.
Okay, that's all right. Well,
I was thinking when you talk about
he is talking.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe you would be compensated about that, but I read those I bought just so I read.
I've never read them either.
No,
what do you say?
I've never read them either.
And I haven't read them either.
Yes.
You wrote them.
No,
Yeah,
but I just
and
wrote
ask
them.
you
I never read them again.
Yeah.
I just many of them I just wrote and sent to the publisher. I never read.
And you didn't
I've never read them
2 or 3
ever.
days. The early ones.
If I wanted to do a sequel, I look at the comic versions.
Yeah.
Because it's quicker to look at the
Children
comics.
come and ask him questions, and when he doesn't know the answers, they look at him like, "You didn't really write these, did you?"